Video games have a long, expansive history, starting from the year 1966. 1966, a man named Ralph Baer made a prototype of the first video game console called the Brown Box. Ralph Baer showed this prototype to multiple companies including RCA, General Electronics, Magnavox, and Warwick Sears. Finally, the Brown Box was licensed by Magnavox and got the name Magnavox's Odyssey. The Magnavox's Odyssey was released in the year 1972 on January 27th and sold 80,000 units that year. The games that the Odyssey offered came with overlays, translucent plastic overlays that gamers could put on their TV screens to stimulate color graphics. The Magnavox's Odyssey came with sports games, horror games, and chase games. The father of video games, Ralph Baer, is now 91 years old, still inventing things for kids in Boston, Massachusetts. The next game console in video game history, after the Magnavox's Odyssey, was Pong. Nolan Bushnell is the founder of Atari, and Al Alcorn was the inventor of Pong. Bushnell got the idea for Pong after seeing a trade show with the Magnavox's Odyssey. Bushnell then decided to work with Al Alcorn, and they produced Pong for a video game cabinet, or as we know them as, an arcade machine. The two put the machine in a bar, and when they saw how many people liked Pong, they decided to make more of these machines. Pong was released in 1972 on November 29th. The two of them bought an old roller derby rink, made their company, and called their company Atari. Bushnell hired many young engineers who were surprisingly convicts and who were on parole. After 2 months, the staff at Atari produced 100 Pong machines a day. Atari was doing so well that they decided to release a home version of Pong. Sears decided to sell the console at their store. Sears wanted 150,000 units made by Christmas season in 1975.
Doreen, I'm sure when you went out last week to play Pong, you got to have so much fun, you just...
One commercial ran, and all 150,000 were sold. Now, even though Atari was doing so well, they suffered a lawsuit against Magnavox. Bushnell saw the Odyssey and instigated the idea to create Pong. The two companies decided to, instead of defending the situation in front of a judge, they would negotiate. Atari and Magnavox negotiated for 4 whole years and finally came to an agreement. Both Ralph Baer and Bushnell met on the steps of the federal court in Chicago in 1976. Bushnell agreed to pay a license fee in recognition of Baer's patents. After a lawsuit with Magnavox, Bushnell went on to create the Atari 2600. This allowed players to play arcade machine games interchangeably. The Atari 2600 was released on September 11, 1977. The system had many famous games such as Kaboom, Space Invaders, and Pac-Man. The Atari 2600 was one of the first home consoles to sell adult video games. This is one of the reasons why we have the ESRB, Entertainment Software Rating Board, that set the rating for games so that kids don't buy M-rated games. With interchangeable games still being a new concept, and video game systems were cloning each other's games, the market was flooded with games. Atari soon suffered because of the rushed production and their top designers already resigning in the past. In December of 1982, E.T., based off the famous 1982 Steven Spielberg film E.T., was released after 5 weeks of production. The game was a failure, with its awful graphics and terrible gameplay. People were upset and wanted refunds on the game, and because of this, Atari was swimming in E.T. cartridges. So Atari brought truckloads of the game and buried most of their copies in Mexico, where the game would never see the light again. You can still buy the game, but at very high prices. E.T. for the Atari 2600 led to the video game crash of 1983. Game consumers were drowning in a flooded console market. Everyone grew out of video games, and or closed their doors to them. This was the beginning of the crash of '83. Oversaturated market, declining games, and competition of Commodore, PC, and Apple computers caused the US video game market to crash. Atari puts an end to the Atari 2600 and numerous game companies go bankrupt. Video game crash lasted for 2 years, but in those 2 years, no games were produced in America, making Americans think that that was the end of video games forever. Then a little company in Japan named Nintendo released to North America the Nintendo Entertainment System, NES for short, in 1985, ending the video game crash of 1983. The NES came with a 2-in-1 game, Duck Hunt, where you shoot ducks and a dog laps at you, and the iconic Italian plumber we know as Mario of the Super Mario Bros. Series. Nintendo brought us many famous titles, like The Legend of Zelda, Donkey Kong, and Mega Man.
I'll never forget the first day I saw the Nintendo Entertainment System. It was in my dad's old car, and my brother told me, hey, we got a NES. And I was like, well, what is that? I had no idea what it was. So we opened up the trunk, and I was like, that looks insane. And it was a surprise. So my dad eventually took it out and hooked it up, and we started playing Mario, and I was blown away. Like, I've never seen anything like that before. And then you press a button and you see the guy jump on the screen, and it's funny because I jumped with him too, and it blew my mind. I remember playing Zelda with my brother and my dad as a little kid. One of my earliest memories with an NES. We would just play in our room for I don't know how long it was, but it was just so magical to me to watch my dad play and cheering him on, and he'd ask us what he should do next, and it was just so much fun hanging out with my dad and my older brother playing like that. And as the years went on, we had so many more wonderful experiences with the Nintendo Entertainment System. It was a lot of fun, and we never overdid it. We'd always still go out and play, but when it was time to play Nintendo, that was some really great memories.
Then one day, in 1986, a company called Sega released the Sega Master System. This started the video game war that we are still in today. The system didn't do too well in America, but did great in Europe. After 3 years, Sega released the 16-bit Sega Genesis, also known as the Mega Drive. The Sega Genesis came with a great library of games like Streets of Rage, Comix Zone, and Golden Axe. After Sega released this intense system, Nintendo in 1991 released the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, SNES for short.
Big, stylish, and now one of the best values in America. Just for a limited time, buy the Super NES Superset and get 5 complete Mario games standard.
The system was such a hit with Super Mario World and The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past.
My experiences with the Super Nintendo all started when I was about 3 or 4. The first game I ever remember playing was Super Mario World. I spent a lot of hours, days, weeks, figuring out every little thing about the game, the hidden secrets. It got to a point where I could beat that game inside and out in a day, simply because I spent so much time as a kid playing it. Older games on the Super Nintendo era were very hard, very unforgiving, but there was a sense of accomplishment and personal pride you had every time you beat it. There was a magical charm to each game, like The Legend of Zelda, Mega Man X, Super Mario World, Super Metroid, that really makes them stand out in gaming history more than anything put out today, simply by difficulty, fun or just overall enjoyment that people have both in current play and in their memories. That's why I think the Super Nintendo is probably the best system ever created.
Then, Sega released their most famous icon, their fast blue hedgehog, Sonic. The two companies were neck and neck, but with dedicated fan base and supports from first and third parties, Nintendo came out in top.
Hey! You still don't have a Sega CD? Huh? What are you waiting for, Nintendo to make one? You have seen the games, right? Wrong answer, man. Show 'em!
Sega then released their newest project, the Sega CD.
Want to see more?
At this time, Nintendo was negotiating with Sony to make a CD add-on for the SNES because Sony had the technology. Nintendo then didn't want to sign a contract with them to make the add-on because Sony wanted Nintendo to show off Sony products. Nintendo then went on to the company Philips, a company that would do almost the same thing as Sony and wanted them to make the CD add-on. Nintendo finally just decided to drop the project altogether, but because Nintendo signed a contract already with Philips, allowing Philips to use the Nintendo characters, Philips made some of their own games with Nintendo characters, such as the 3 Zelda games and the Mario game. These games were awful and were failures, yet they are extremely rare and extremely expensive.
Mysterious machine has appeared in homes across America.
32X. Redouble his power.
Go! Just stick it in your Genesis.
Alright.
Sega then made the 32X that connected to the Sega Genesis like a cartridge but ran off its own power and needed their own auxiliary cables. This system was a failure too. Sony in December 1994 then released their first video game system, the PlayStation. Sony released all sorts of 3D games. They released Frogger, Spyro, and Crash Bandicoot. Until they released their profitable games that we know to this day, like Tomb Raider, Resident Evil,
A dining room.
and GTA. Sony had entered the video game war now. Nintendo then, on September 29th, 1996, released their first 3D console, the Nintendo 64, N64 for short. The Nintendo 64 sold in the first 4 months 500,000 units, and in December 2009, systems sold 32.93 million units worldwide. The Nintendo 64 had an amazing library of games. Mario 64, Mario Party, Donkey Kong 64, Smash Brothers, and The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Which is still holds first in the greatest game ever made list. Nintendo later went on to decide to add a disk drive to the Nintendo 64, but scrapped the idea. Sega, after releasing failed systems like the Sega CD and 32X, came out with the Sega Dreamcast.
So, the reason why I play the Dreamcast is because every weekend, my parents and I would always go over to my aunt's house, and my aunt has a cousin who I would play the Dreamcast with, and we would always take turns playing Sonic Adventure together. And when I finally had to move to New Jersey, my cousin gave me the Dreamcast and a copy of Sonic Adventure for me to play when I moved to my new home as a way to remember him by. So I did, and eventually I had enough money for Sonic Adventure 2. Those were really the only games I ever played on the Dreamcast, but I still had a lot of fun and always played them all the time.
It too had 3D graphics and had discs for games just like the Sega CD and Sony's PlayStation. Sega then dropped out because Sony released the PlayStation 2. The PlayStation has one of the longest lifespans. Sega finally became a third-party company. Microsoft got in on the video game war and released their first system, the Xbox, in November 2001. Microsoft then released a famous game called Halo for the Xbox. So, Nintendo released the only system to have a handlebar attached to it, the GameCube. The GameCube brought us many famous titles like Luigi's Mansion, Mario Sunshine, and Super Smash Bros. Melee. All three companies were doing well until Microsoft released the Xbox 360 on November 22nd, 2005. Following year, Sony released the PlayStation 3, and Nintendo released the Revolution, later called the Wii. The Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 were more aimed towards adults with all the FPS, first-person shooter, games, and the Wii was aimed towards kids and families with Mario Party and family-friendly games. Finally, Nintendo released the Wii U on November 18th. The Wii U came with a tablet so you can play games on your tablet instead of the TV. Sony then released the PlayStation 4 on November 13th, and Microsoft released the Xbox One 9 days after the release of the PlayStation 4.
I feel games have improved because of the way they can be told. From the graphics that you see now, to music and storytelling, everything has changed from the way it was because we're no longer restricted in how everything can be done.
Video games have a long, expansive history. From Ralph Baer's no sound, no graphics video game console came video game consoles that we know today. Games seem to be growing with no signs of stopping. That was the history of video games.